This week we've heard in earlier weeks about philosophical influences underpinning British government, an element about a week about the Constitution, and also about development of institutions and the civil service. This week we're going to hear from Professor George Jones about Parliament and government. George previously taught on GV311, a very different version of GV311 in years gone by. Hasn't taught on a GV course, he tells me now, for a decade, so this is a return, a glorious return to the school for George. He's Emeritus Professor in the Government Department, and he's just published a book which is an event tomorrow evening at the Elbow of Power.
At Power's
Sorry,
Elbow.
At Power's Elbow. Sorry, let me get this right. So there's another event tomorrow evening that you can come along to hear he and his co-author Andrew Blick talk about the advisors, people who are indeed at the elbow of power, everybody from Sir Robert Walpole to David Cameron, a fetching picture on the front cover of the book of David Cameron with Andy Coulson. Anyway, this evening is not to do with that at all. It's to do with Parliament. Well, it is, but to do with Parliament and government. And in the normal tradition, George will speak for about an hour, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and discussion. George.
Thank you, Tony. Well, it's very difficult to tell you really what the purpose of
Before you start, one more thing. There will be a handout. Not slides this week, but a handout, which two handouts, which Matthew will give you for those of you on the course at class on Friday. George, sorry.
Well, I'm going to say it's very difficult to tell you what the purpose of Parliament is and what its relationship is with government, because, first of all, we have no codified written constitution or any organic fundamental law. I can't produce a document and called the British Constitution which shows you what Parliament is all about. We rely on conventions, customary practices that work. That's the first difficulty. And secondly, there's no agreement amongst parliamentarians and commentators on what the purpose of Parliament is. Some fall into the traditionalist camp, others are modernisers. If you recall Professor Kelly's lecture, he talked about the traditionalists and the rationalisers. Well, the modernisers are today's rationalisers. My method is to tell you really my reflections on what Parliament is and its relations with government based on a study of what actually happens. A realist approach. And again, another difficulty is that since 1997 there have been major changes to Parliament. And when you have these major changes, you only know the consequences 30 years later, when a new generation, unused to the old ways, has thoroughly taken over. Now, a point of definition. When people use the word Parliament, they usually think of the House of Commons, 650 MPs. But there are two houses of Parliament. There's the elected, directly elected Commons, and the non-elected House of Lords. At the moment, 835 of them. Soon, in a few weeks, to have 30 more, or so we're told. Take care when you hear the word Parliament and ask, what is it that's being talked about? Are they talking about the House of Commons? Are they talking about the House of Lords? Are they talking about them together? And there's another problematic word, sovereignty. We often hear about parliamentary sovereignty. It's often said to lie with Parliament. Well, sovereignty doesn't lie with just one House of Commons. It doesn't lie either with the two Commons and Lords. Sovereignty lies with a trinity: Crown, Lords and Commons. Those three elements have to agree for an Act of Parliament to have legal force. The word Crown, it now means the government. It doesn't mean the Queen, the monarch sitting on the throne. Once upon a time, back in the Middle Ages, and Professor Martin Loughlin told you, I think, about the importance of the medieval background to much of our current constitution. Once, in the Middle Ages, the monarch led the government. But over time, the governing power of the monarch moved. It moved to reside in the cabinet, which is now the political directorate of the United Kingdom, leaving the monarch personally as largely a ceremonial figurehead. So sovereign power now is the Crown, that is the government in Parliament. And you can see that if you look at the opening words of any statute. It conveys what it's all about. Be it enacted by the Queen's most excellent Majesty, which really means now the government, by and with the advice and consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons in this present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same as follows, and then the Act begins. That was what it was in the Middle Ages, still is today. Now I'm going to focus mainly on the House of Commons because it's more important than the House of Lords, because it has a legitimacy and authority that comes from it being directly elected, which the House of Lords, a non-elected body, lacks. Now the House of Lords, I'd better say something about it, its roles. It carries out many of the functions that take place in the Commons. It can ask questions of ministers, have debates in its chamber, inquire in its committees, but it can't veto legislation desired by the Commons. It can delay, it can't stop, but it can delay if it disagrees with a bill that's come up from the Commons. It can delay it coming into law for one session, about 13 months in practice. Because if the Commons brings forward the same bill in the same words in the next session, the Lords can't stop it. They can't even delay a money bill. That's a bill dealing with taxing and spending. They have to accept a money bill that comes from the Commons, typically the budget, as long as the Commons Speaker declares it is a money bill. Are my earphones making a noise?
No, fine.
I want to begin with what the House of Commons doesn't do, but many people may tell you it does. Now, I don't know if any Americans are here, but they will tell me that the House of Commons, like Congress, must be a branch of government. They see their Congress, Senate and House, the Representative Assembly, the Assembly, as part of government. I'm afraid that's very misleading here. Governing is something that the government does. That's the executive, or it's sometimes called the Crown, which is headed by the Cabinet. They do the governing together with the civil servants that Kate Jenkins talked about last week. The United Kingdom does have a separation of functions. The government governs, Parliament doesn't govern, it does something else. Supervises the government, watches what the government's doing. I think the United Kingdom has a real separation of functions compared to the United States, where they separate the people. They have a separation of people, not functions. In Britain, if you want to be a minister in the executive, in that political directorate, you need to be in Parliament, either Commons or Lords. The United States separates the people in that you cannot be inside the executive in the president's cabinet at the same time as you are in their Congress. So it doesn't govern. Another function it doesn't do is legislate. But surely we call the House of Commons a legislature. That is a body that makes the laws of the land. Well, I want to put it to you that that role is mainly carried out by the government. Just think of the way a law is made. It usually begins, well, most legislation comes from government. There's a little bit left for what we call private members' bills, where backbenchers can bring forward measures. Go beneath the surface of those backbench bills, and you often find, if they're not bills promoted through some interest group or pressure group, they're bills that the government would rather like, and they welcome the opportunity to have an MP who will promote one of their bills in this way. But most legislation comes from the government, and it's shaped and worked on inside the government departments by civil servants and ministers who carry out extensive negotiations with various interest groups, pressure groups, and lobbies. It then goes from the executive to Parliament, and then it whizzes around inside the parliamentary black box, and the procedures of Parliament tackle legislation. A lot of time is spent. One author says a third of the time of Parliament is spent doing something to legislation. And then it comes out of the parliamentary process in much the same shape as it went in. The fundamental features remain. There are sometimes some alterations. The government itself may have brought forward amendments when it's had second thoughts after responding to pressure. Introducing the amendments itself very often. Usually, though, on the details, not the fundamental aspects of the bill. They remain intact. Now, this isn't a strange outcome. The government has a majority in the Commons. Well, that's why it's the government, because it does have a majority, and having a majority means it can control the agenda. There's a very small bit of the proceedings left for backbenchers to control. They shovel them off into what's called Westminster Hall debates, very marginal, minor activities. But the agenda is controlled by the government. It, of course, controls the vote at the end. Rebelliousness has increased, but it still usually, normally, gets its way. So I would argue to you that in this country it's the government, the executive, that performs the legislative role. Parliament isn't legislating. Rather, it is legitimising. What's going on is that the the parliamentary processes are giving a mark of approval, conferring authority on the law, on the statute, and it's showing, therefore, to the people that this is now the law of the land and you'd better obey it. That's what's happening, legitimising, not legislating. And then the final thing that Parliament doesn't do, some people tell us it does, is to control the nation's finances. Now, anybody who's a historian will know that control over the purse was the key to Parliament winning authority over the king. The king wanted money from the representatives in the Commons, and they wouldn't give it unless they got the king to conform with policies to what they wanted. So in the past, the rise of the Commons was very much associated with it being in control of the money. My argument is that now it's not Parliament that controls finance, it's the government, especially its most important department, the Treasury. That's where financial control really lies. The Commons itself can't initiate the expenditure of money, can't initiate tax proposals. What we call the financial initiative lies with the government, as it has done since the 17th century, when a resolution was passed, and some would say even earlier in medieval times. Notice the Commons has no expenditure committee. It hasn't got a taxation committee. There's no estimates committee. It has only one committee that seems to be doing something to finance, and that's a very, very important committee, the senior select committee of the House, the Public Accounts Committee, set up in the 1860s. And that's the committee which examines government spending to ensure that the government has spent the taxpayers' money as Parliament intended, examining if the money has been spent effectively, economically, efficiently, and with due propriety, that there's been no fiddling, embezzlement, misuse of taxpayers' money. But when the Public Accounts Committee comes on the scene, the money's already been spent, and all the textbooks usually have the phrase, it's like locking the door of the stable after the horse has run away. So you can't really say that financial control is one of the roles of Parliament. Parliament, in carrying out these functions, what it's doing is a kind of ritual. It can influence government, as parliamentary influence, all right, but it isn't itself governing. The governing function is for the executive. What Parliament is doing is something different. Let me now be positive and tell you what I think Parliament does. And there are 7 headings, 7 roles. First, debate. That is, it holds a parley. Now, have you ever thought what Parliament means, what the word means? Parliament. It's one of Professor Laughlin's medieval terms. 1265 is often said to be the beginning of Parliament. And that word, Parliament, it's old Norman French, because after all we've been conquered by the French. They imposed their system, they oppressed the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons, they chucked them off the land. These were the Norman oppressors, and they insisted on the use of their language. So in these early days, Parliament was a word to describe the occasion when the king conducted a parley, held a dialogue with the great landowners, the feudal lords, secular and the bishops, who were great landowners themselves, in the House of Lords. And also they conducted the dialogue, the parley, with the representatives from the communities into which this country was divided, the urban communities, boroughs, and the rural communities, shires. They would gather the community representatives in the commons. Now, here's another word. Commons is nothing to do with common people. It doesn't refer to commoners. Again, it's Norman French. Communes. It's the communities, the places, the borough, the urban areas, the shire, rural areas that the members represented. House of Communes is what it was in the Middle Ages. And that's why in so much of the House of Commons procedures they always refer, the Right Honourable Member for, and they mention the constituency, the place they represent. What was going on in the Middle Ages was the king wanted the Commons to vote money from the taxes that would be levied on them. You wouldn't levy taxes on the great lords. They would never have accepted a land tax, and they still don't. We haven't got a proper land tax today because the aristocracy, the upper elites, they won't have that. They didn't in the Middle Ages, they don't today. So it's the Commons from which taxation is to be levied. The kings wanted the taxes basically to finance their wars. On the side of the Commons, they would come to the parley, having the dialogue with the king, urging the king to follow the policies they wanted. They may have objected to the wars and the causes that the king was promoting. And also, they were begging the king, petitioning the king to redress their grievances, the problems that they in their localities had, or other irritations. That was the medieval system. That's what Parliament was about in the Middle Ages. Now, I don't know whether Professor Loughlin deplored the medieval relics, but it's still the same today. That basically is what happens today. The government, the executive, the Crown, asks the Commons for support for its policies and its spending plans, just as the king did in the Middle Ages. And then the debate takes place. Now, some critics, the rationalisers, they condemn the Commons as, it's just a talking shop. But that's what Parliament means. Parliament means talking shop, a place for the parley, a dialogue. And you've only got to go into the Commons and you can see the importance of what I've just said. You look at the central carpet that runs through the Commons. There are two lines in front of the benches. And those two lines are said to be 2 sword lengths apart. And you're not to step over the line, because if you did, you'd be able to stab your opponent. And the whole point of Parliament is that it was a displacement for war and battle into debate and talking. As Churchill said, jaw is better than war. What's going on is a fight with, not with swords, as in The olden days, the lines kept them apart. And this also shows you an important truth. The rationalisers don't really understand. It is supposed to be an adversarial game. They criticise the to and fro between government and opposition, the rows they have. It's supposed to be like that. It's an adversarial chamber of debate. Debating. Secondly, what I call the supportive role. The Commons provides support for the government and opposition to that government. Most MPs are elected because of the party label they carry, so they go to the Commons to support their parties. That's what the voters have voted for. They want their MPs to be party politicians, supporting their parties. The majority will be supporting the government, and the rest will be supporting opposition to the government. That's why they've been elected in the first place. Now, in the Commons, usually the government wins, but not always, and there have been some spectacular defeats. I think they've largely arisen because of the difficulties of being in coalition. Now, it's very important to realise that the Commons can kill the government by voting. The Commons can vote, we have no confidence in Her Majesty's government. Happened in 1924, it happened in 1979. That was the last time vote of confidence destroyed a government. There was only one vote. There's that marvellous play at the National Theatre, it's moved out since, called This House, and it goes through the events very accurately, to my mind, of what happened in 1979 when Jim Callaghan's Labour government was destroyed, general election was called, Mrs Thatcher's party won, and Labour was out of government for 18 years. So it's in everybody's mind, in government and Parliament, that the House does have the capacity to destroy the government. Can't do it in the States. Well, you'd have to, I suppose, invoke impeachment proceedings against the President. The power to end a government is always there in the background. The government knows it, and that means it doesn't act in such a way that it would provoke MPs into a vote of no confidence. And it's really from that power to destroy the government that the influence of the Commons flows. That's where it really comes from. Supporting government and opposition to that government. Supporting a system of adversarial politics. That's what the voters construct Parliament for. The third function is exposing role. The House of Commons exposes the government's actions and its inactions, its failures to act. It calls the government to give an account of what it's done or not done, making the government answer questions, making it come forward with statements. So what's going on here is a process that's a pressure for open government. It makes government accountable. That's where the accountability of government lies. Fourth, educate. It educates the educative function. It educates the nation about political issues, great and small. It provides, what goes on in Parliament usually provides the most important stories in the media about government and politics outside the party conference season. When Parliament isn't sitting, there isn't all that much political news. Now, what the House of Commons is doing is to make politics understandable and interesting. I think you've got to bear in mind that most normal, healthy, balanced individuals, most people, aren't interested in politics. It comes low down on the list of their priorities. What shall I spend my time on? Oh, active in politics. It's family, friends, loved ones, hobbies, sports, entertainment, culture, work. These things usually take precedence with most normal, healthy, balanced people. Politics is low down on their list. Now, this is a problem for democracy. How can we have a true democracy if, on the whole, people are baffled by what politics is all about? They're not interested in it. They don't understand or follow the complicated issues of politics and policy and the strange language that is used, full of abstractions. Do you really think the word inflation immediately lights up in people's minds and they know what it means? And the world of politics, they keep using percentages. Most people have no idea what percentage really means. So what the Commons does, it makes complex issues comprehensible for the people. Now, it does it, I use two images here for what is going on. It makes politics like a sport. Now, people are interested in sport. You can tell that. You watch people when they pick up a newspaper on the... Where do they go? Back page. They love their sport. You've got teams to cheer or to boo. For some reason, a lot of people boo Manchester United. Now, my son is a supporter of Liverpool. He can't stand Manchester United. And that's the sort of attitude a lot of people have about sport. But they do understand politics when it's made and commented on as a sport. The other image is theatre. They like drama and theatre or films with television, with theatrical aspects. And the House of Commons presents politics as theatre. The MPs are giving performances all the time. Marvellous performances. Wouldn't actors love to be there with those monologues? And they're judged by people who are watching, who follow the play. The critics are up in the galleries writing their critiques, just as the drama critics and TV and film critics do. MPs are giving performances that are judged by those who follow the play. There's the characters to applaud, others to hiss. So what's going on is the House of Commons is informing the people, it's simplifying, it's making it understandable, it's dramatising it, inciting their interests. And in doing so, it helps to shape the views of the public. It helps to shape public opinion. Difficult to do when the public isn't really interested. Fifthly, the expressive function. It expresses the nation's concerns. MPs speak out for their localities, problems facing their constituencies. They speak out about the concerns of different groups, pressure groups, interest groups, cause groups. And they also speak out on matters that affect particular individuals. A lot of the MP's time is spent on dealing with individual constituents' complaints. Their letters, the post bags are full of individual complaints. When they go back to their local constituency and they hold what we call their surgeries, people come in with very personal problems. MPs, as they deal with this, are performing the representative role. That's a fancy term for this expressive function. If you examine parliamentary questions, you see all sorts of things being raised and expressed by the MPs in the debates, in the committees, and in the letters that MPs send to ministers. They are here expressing the concerns, anxieties, worries of the people. Now, a very high official of Parliament performs an important role here. He's called the Parliamentary Commissioner for Administration, popularly known as the Ombudsman. It was set up, this mechanism, to me fairly late, 1967, sometimes called the grievance man or woman now, to whom MPs take complaints from their constituents about maladministration by government. Maladministration. Citizens send their complaints about what government departments have been up to, how they've been mistreated, and some of them can be sent by MPs for investigation by the Parliamentary Commissioner for Administration. This is not illegality. Maladministration isn't illegal. That's for the courts. That's a different thing entirely. And the Ombudsman is kept very well occupied. The sixth function, scrutiny. Parliament scrutinises the government, its legislative proposals, its policies, expenditure, administration, through committees. This is where parliamentary committees come in, basically two types: select committees and public bill committees. Public bill committees examine proposed legislation in detail, clause by clause, in rooms that are arranged as if they were mini House of Commons. Two sides, one government, one opposition. Two groups of opposing MPs face each other and they debate these clauses. The House has already debated as a whole, in full chamber, the broad principles of the bill in what we call the second reading. The next stage is to send these bills to the committee stage, and that's what these public bill committees do. Select committees inquire and investigate policy, administration and expenditure. These are committees of inquiry. They are arranged very differently. You go into a select committee room and you see that the arrangement is like a horseshoe. The members sit around the horseshoe and then in the gap, witnesses come to give evidence, to be cross-examined. That's a select committee. Now, the current arrangements for select committees, there's always been select committees. Before 1979, you had them for this and that. They were set up, special inquiry, back in the 19th century, even earlier, to do special inquiries. And then, when they'd finished, they vanished. That was them. 1979 is important, because it's the first time we got a system of select committees covering the departments of government. This was really the first Thatcherite reform, the first major piece of reform by Mrs. Thatcher. 1979, she set up, well, her leader of the House, St John Stevens, was the minister. He was responsible for getting this system of departmental select committees established. Now, isn't it interesting how left-wing parties, liberal parties, usually condemn Thatcherism and its reforms, but here we have the first Thatcherite reform applauded by the left and the liberals. And not only that, they want to beef up the select committees and make them even more powerful. What they'd like, one of the things they'd like, is that they want departmental select committees to have many more resources spent on their investigations. What they'd love is for these departmental select committees to have the same sort of administrative backup that the Public Accounts Committee has. Now, I mentioned that earlier on, the one set up in 1861, the one that's the most senior of select committees. And that select committee has a very high official of Parliament to assist it, called the Comptroller and Auditor General, who runs a national audit office of over 800 auditors probing government spending, checking up on how the government has been spending taxpayers' money. The other select committees are very weakly supported. They have a clerk, some assistants from junior clerks. It's very feeble. They can draw on an expert or two to assist them. They have not got the resources available to them that the Public Accounts Committee has, so they wish they had. And then there's the final, my seventh set of functions. It's really a triple function. It's the place where one recruits ministers, where one trains them, and where one assesses them. The House of Commons is the recruiting centre for ministers. In this country, we draw our ministers overwhelmingly from the House of Commons. The most important ones are there's a few from the Lords, but they're not really major figures. We don't, as in, say, the United States, compose our cabinet secretaries, ministers from business, banking, universities, law firms. We have a very focused, very narrow, if you like, base from which we draw our ministers. Perhaps in the olden days, if students asked me how could they become a minister and parliamentary and a prime minister, I'd have to tell them, well, get yourself elected for a safe seat. You may have to fight a seat that's unsafe first, but then get a safe seat and then get into win a reputation in the House as a good parliamentary performer. Because the House Recruiting Centre, it's a training college for ministers. That's where MPs learn how to be a minister. If you're a new MP, you watch how the successful ministers behave in the House. You learn who to imitate. You learn what not to do by seeing those who fall down. Parliamentary expertise, skill in speaking and handling Parliament is essential for ministers. Now, oh dear, the rationalisers are aghast at that. They think ministers should be managers. Oh, they should be managing their big department. That's the skill they need to be managers. Well, that's a load of rubbish. Ministers are politicians, they're elected representatives. They are there to bring their particular skill, which is, their specialism is politics. They should apply their political sensitivities to the political issues. They've got civil servants that Kate told us about last week, who are paid very high salaries to do the management, not ministers. There's a minister, well, there was, Michael Heseltine, Lord Heseltine. Well, he was a bit of a strange figure. He took great pride that he was a manager of departments, and he created all sorts of business wheezes to manage his department. He bored stiff the other ministers, because they say, well, that's not what we're doing, that's not what we're about. We employ civil servants to manage. We're doing something else. Well, it's their training college, and that is that you do well in the Commons, you speak out, you make good speeches that damage the opposition and raise the morale of your own side. And then you come to the notice of your party leaders who think that would be a good person to have in the government. And then up you go, up the greasy pole. And then you become a minister, and the Commons, this is the third part of this final function, it's their assessment centre. It's where ministers are continually being assessed. They have to come to the House very, very frequently, very often, speak in the House, defending what their department's doing, promoting the projects and programmes of their departments. And when they're there, standing up, they're facing the opposition, a critical opposition, doing all sorts of things to unsettle them. And it isn't just the opposition in front of them that they have to worry about. That's the opposition. We know what oppositions get up to. But behind them are the enemy. That's how the ministers see their backbenchers. They talk about the enemy behind us. Because there's people there who think, oh, I could do a better job than this man or woman. I want that job. And the knives are always ready to stab the back of the minister. So what ministers have to do is, dealing with the opposition is usually easy, but dealing with the enemies behind, raising the morale of your supporters, keeping them happy, that's a very important task that's performed. And the MPs are continually being assessed by their own people, and the leaders are watching. They've got to show, when appearing before the assessment centre, that they've got a grip on their departments and what's going on, that they can beat the opposition. There's a marvellous battle going on at the moment on any education issue between Michael Gove, Secretary of State for Education, and the new Tristram Hunt on the education. There's a real tussle between the two of them, striving, and they're both very good. And it's one of the best interactions that you can see in the theatre of politics these days. Now, if you make a poor performance, if you perform badly in the Commons, you can have your career damaged. A real setback can occur. The future prospects of the ministers are damaged. They're thought by the leadership to be hopeless, not a safe pair of hands. And they may be removed from the government, as we've seen in the very recent reshuffle, when many of the people, the junior ministers, have departed. Now that's what I think Parliament does. There's a worrying concern that I must mention, The reputation of MPs and Lords has been damaged in recent years by revelations of their excessive claims for expenses, even cheating, and some have gone to jail. The media, the press in particular, has been ruthless in exposing these failings by MPs. They've argued that the people who should have been controlling the nation's spending have been revealed as failing to control their own spending. The MPs, the political class, has been very disturbed by this vicious attack by the media, particularly the press. And they are now getting their own back. If you want an explanation for what's going on with regulating the press, it's ministers and government and MPs generally. It's across all parties. They want to get their own back and have a regulated press that never again spills the beans about how they use their expenses or what they're getting up to. That's what I see as the main reason for this current furore about regulating the press. Conclusions. The British Parliament differs from the US Congress in that it's, the House of Commons, is what we can call an arena assembly, A-R-E-N-A, an arena assembly, and not a transformative assembly. This distinction was expressed by distinguished American political scientist Nelson Polsby, who looked at legislative bodies, assemblies around the world, and he said there's only two types. A transformative assembly, of which the US Congress was typical, is a place where the elected representatives carry into the Congress pressures from society. And then inside Congress, they interact, they shape and they mould legislation. They do it themselves. And you see this in the bills that eventually emerge as statutes in the states are often named after those Congress representatives who have promoted that legislation. Very hard to put an MP's name to the legislation that comes out of the Commons because it's, as I've explained, mainly government. So the idea is that the Congress itself is a kind of corporate body in which interactions take place and the pressures of society are transformed into legislation. The United Kingdom's Parliament, Polsby argued, was a typical arena assembly, not a corporate institution, doesn't really make laws itself, but it provides a location for a contest. It's like an arena, sports arena or a bull ring. They're not the House of Commons. Parliament isn't a corporate institution or formal organisation with its own legal personality. They do things in those activities, as I've explained, holding ministers to account, influencing government policy and legislation, and exercising the most influence by what political scientists call the rule of anticipated reactions. This, to me, is one of the most important rules of political science. This law is that governments think ahead when they're planning their legislation, their statutes, when they're thinking and shaping policy. They think ahead and try to anticipate the likely reactions of Parliament of their MPs. So the Commons exerts considerable influence over the government at this early stage, because no government wants to bring forward proposals that will incite strong opposition from MPs and the country. And normally, the MPs, the government correctly anticipates the likely reactions of MPs. They have the whips, chief whip, and the levels of junior whips whose job is to keep a close contact with their MPs, to shepherd them through the lobbies, true, like sheep, but also to find out what's worrying them and what they don't like about government policy, and finding ways to allay their anxieties. The whips are very important here. Before the stuff has really come forward into the House, so that normally the proposals of government sail through the procedures of the Commons with little fundamental change, as I argued at the beginning. So the House of Commons has had a big influence, but it's not overt and explicit. It's not open. It's covert and hidden, but it's been important and has had an impact all the same. So I'm not somebody who says, oh dear, the government controls the House of Commons. The House of Commons really does control the government. It sets the limits over what government can do, and through the rule of anticipated reactions, it does have an impact. Now, its influence derives, as I said, from its power to destroy a government by a vote of no confidence. It can make or break a government if it wants to. It can be said to control the government, but it's become harder to do so since the Fixed Term Parliaments Act of 2011. This is an important act. It fixes the date of the next general election. It's 7th of May 2015. So we know it provides for 5-year fixed terms. It does enable the Prime Minister to have some leeway. Previously, it was the Prime Minister's decision when to have an election. So there's been a sharp curtailment of the Prime Minister's powers. The Act does include provisions that allow the Prime Minister to alter the date by up to 2 months by order. So May the 7th, but it could go 2 months over. The Prime Minister could. Now, there are 2 ways in which an election could be triggered before the end of a 5-year term. I mean, remember how I told you about 1979? Just 1 vote did it for the Prime Minister Callaghan, and then that was the end. Had to be a general election. Well, that's gone. There are 2 ways now to trigger a general election within a 5-year term. If a motion of no confidence is passed, House votes, we have no confidence in Her Majesty's government, and then within 14 days, no alternative government's been found in which the House has expressed confidence. If they can't do the deals and get a government up and running in 14 days, general election. The other way, if a motion for an early general election is agreed by 2/3 of the House, or without a division. So you need a 2/3 majority of MPs to get an election. Now, we hear all about the power of the Prime Minister's increased. Well, here we have a major decrease in the power of the Prime Minister. And what this means is essentially that Parliament has enhanced its control over the government. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Now, caught me unaware at the end there. Short, abrupt. Now, I think
6 o'clock.
Well, 6 o'clock. Yeah, no, fine. 6:05. Jack, and Josh, and Joe, very alliterative. You had some questions you'd like to ask, so Jack, why not start? And I'll repeat them just for the microphone is coming, but I'll repeat them anyway.
You mentioned the style of the Commons as being very adversarial in nature and the layout of it reflecting that. In recent years we've seen a decline in the dominance of the two major parties in the UK. I think in 2010 less than 50% of constituencies were dominated by Labour and Conservatives as the two main parties. Do you think that adversarial politics is still appropriate for the Commons on that basis?
Well, we shall see. Our colleague Patrick Dunleavy is always making much of this point.
He will be speaking next term.
But, he would support the point of your question, that adversarial politics will be very hard to fit in to a system in which there are far more parties, other MPs with allegiance to other parties. At the moment, the House is structured in such a way that there's government and opposition. The Lib Dems have all come over to the government side. We shall see. We shall see what persists. Perhaps we will go back to the mid-19th century, the era so beloved of Walter Bagehot, when between roughly the 1840s and the 1860s, there wasn't a single party. You had fluctuating majorities. I can't see that that is going to improve public policy making or government. You can never be sure what's going to happen. You do need, if you're to have collective action by government, a period of stability. If government is to promise things at elections, it needs to be able to deliver on those promises. But it's probably, if you're right, it won't be sure. There will be a period of instability. Perhaps then there'll be a reaction and people will see the advantage of having large parties. We still have got our electoral system, which does work against the coming of these smaller parties, but as we've seen, it doesn't guarantee that the two parties will maintain their dominance. This is all in the future. I was originally a historian. I know how difficult it is to find out what happened in the past. If you're studying modern politics, it's difficult to know what's going on now. And you're asking me to be a prophet and to speculate. I've never liked that. It's, you know, I'm not a prophet.
But I mean, even with the traditions, the majoritarian traditions that we have, and the arrangement of the Commons chambers you've described it, even, you're absolutely right, if you look at the proportion voting, if the Conservative plus Labour, so the two big bloc parties, coalition, each a coalition, the proportion of the electorate voting for those two parties has declined, and we talked about this in the first week, from about 97% in 1955 election to around 65%, I think, in the 2010 election. Now, with the Conservatives not winning an outright majority, lo and behold, in this new system with more parties, or potentially many more MPs not Conservative and Labour, lo and behold, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats then get together to form a powerful majoritarian government which still fulfills the government and opposition function you've just described. So you could say that even if there was a radical fragmentation, that whilst you would get more rebellions potentially, you'd still find the instinct, at least for a while, to create these powerful majorities with government and opposition.
And the incentive is always to win the prize, the cabinet and positions, because if you've got a majority, cobble it together, you've got control of the government and the civil service that Kate talked of.
Right. Okay.
And that'll be a pressure to counter the fragmentation that you see coming.
Because it was discussed immediately after the last election, after all, that Labour would try to put together a coalition with the Liberal Democrats and a string of smaller parties. So that could have been the outcome, and that would have had several parties on the government benches and possibly 2 or 3 on the opposition benches. And that principle can go a long way.
They could have gone on to a minority government and challenged all the other parties, come together to chuck us out. That would have been very, very unstable.
Okay.
The quest is to have that majority.
Josh.
So up until the 1970s, there used to be a convention, I think what Schwartz called as the Parliamentary rule. The idea that if a government was defeated on one of its own policy proposals in the Commons, that it would be treated as a vote of no confidence and that it would need to resign. But we've seen that fade away. Why do you think that is?
When I used to give my GV311 lectures before 1975, discussing key conventions of the Constitution, I mentioned that parliamentary rule, that a government could be defeated on a vote of no confidence, or if it brought forward a proposal, a major proposal, and that was defeated. Well, during Jim Callaghan's period, his government was defeated on an important issue of public expenditure. And the government didn't fall, and he was quizzed about this and said, well, it wasn't a vote of confidence. I didn't say, we never said in advance that this was a confidence matter. A vote of confidence, if I've got a proposal as Prime Minister, I would have to say this is a matter of confidence, and you'd have to vote. He never said that. I had to drop that parliamentary rule from my lecture and say the government doesn't necessarily fall. The next day, they come back and have another vote of confidence, and the government gets a clear majority. But that particular parliamentary rule has gone. I've described, and because it is important, the ways now in which votes of no confidence could bring down a government. And this Fixed-Term Parliaments Act has vastly altered that.
Chair.
So you mentioned how you felt that it was not the House of Commons that legislated, but the government generally. But you did make the exception for private members' bills. And there's also private bills too, which is primarily the House of Lords phenomenon, but they're just not worth discussing. Do you think the actual amount of private members' bills that are being passed independently from the government is going to further decrease? I was just having a look on the House of Commons library there, and in this Parliament there's been no private members' bills that have been successful that have come from the opposition benches. And that's in sharp contrast in the past, where I think we had the Abortion Act that actually came from Liberals who were in opposition. And even in the previous Parliament, much less significant acts, but like Sustainable Communities Act, came from the Tories. And in particular, you've got the EU referendum bill going through now as a private members' bill, when in effect it's government business.
Yeah.
Do you think this is just kind of an outlier, this Parliament, or do you think we're going to see a trend away from private members' bills towards even more government legislation?
I think I did mention in passing private members' legislation, or as it were in brackets, and I was discussing saying most legislation comes from the government, initiated by the government. There's some private members' bills, and I did make the point that when you scratch beneath the surface and looked where did this private member's bill begin, you find that it's often something that was on the table in the government department, and they itched to have this. They couldn't fix it into their general so they could get a private member to do it. I'm very well aware of private members' legislation. Here's the list that you will have seen of the present ones. About 12 or so each year stand a chance of getting through. They need government time, really. The government really needs to favour those bills and allow it time and tell the whips, you know, we'll get this one through. We like it. And otherwise, they can talk it out. They can get members to speak and speak and speak and keep the debate going till the time's finished. Now, you mentioned a particular period when private members' legislation was particularly important in the 60s, 70s, when particularly Roy Jenkins was Home Secretary, and a lot of what you'd call liberal sort of reforms got through as private members. But that was because Jenkins was in favour, time was found, the whips were put on to help. I don't think there's been such a creative period when those issues of what you might call conscience, abortion, legalising homosexuality, ending theatre. There was a series of these liberal measures. They wouldn't have got through if the government hadn't wanted them. And it was convenient that it was private members to do it.
But equally, the government of the day didn't really want to promote them itself, did it? So there was almost a deal. I mean, the government itself wouldn't have wanted to take such, what were then very, as now, but much more controversial issues.
Well, on many of those issues that we've mentioned, within the Labour, which is the government, within the Labour Party there was opposition from the more traditional working class sort of MP who wouldn't have any truck with this sort of newfangled liberalism of Roy Jenkins. So the only way you could get the measures through was by making it a matter of conscience and allowing people a free vote, so you could bring in Liberals, Conservatives and others to vote in their favour. As Tony says, but again, it's the government that's really pulling the strings.
Okay, want to broaden it out? Any further questions or thoughts any you'd like to bring to bear?
Yes.
Yes, gentleman at the back. Okay, just to repeat that question, at the moment, you often, if you look at Parliament or go to Parliament, you can visit it on Parliament TV, it's easily done live, you'll see 15 or fewer, a tiny number of MPs in the chamber. Though when there's a vote, there will be 400, 500, 600 of them there, potentially, when they come out to vote. And I think the question was about whether or not, with the extent to which MPs know what they're voting about, without detailed explanations in an explanatory note to the legislation. Is that right? So when they come to vote in large numbers, having not been in the chamber, how do they know what they are voting about?
Well, it's a matter of trust. They trust their colleagues. They trust the whips. The whips will tell them, come on, get in there, and you go with your team. You don't want yourself individually to get all entangled in the detail of these complex bills and get you've got your own particular causes you want to promote. But you go with your team. That's what you've been sent to Parliament to do by your voters, to go with your team. And don't forget, voting is a very physical thing in Britain. It isn't remote, pressing buttons. It's walking. going through those lobby doors, iron no. And you can be seen going by the enemy. So you know where your interests are. You're a loyal party member. Why should you want to scratch your head and wonder, well, what am I voting for? This is unrealistic. So I'm not worried at all.
Is this, I mean, we're going to stop in a minute, is this a system, the UK parliamentary and government system, one that you could, put in a framework with which it compares easily with others in other countries, other sort of aspects of it you can stand back from and say, well, sort of in a theory, this fits in a particular part of the way the world arranges government and parliamentary systems? Or is it a unique freestanding system? And there are obviously elements of it that resemble, as you've said, those in other countries. You mentioned the United States. But is it a system that has that fits into a framework where you could say, well, other countries are like this?
Well, Nelson Polsby, in that very important article I mentioned, does look at such assemblies, parliaments around the world, and came to the conclusion that Britain and America were at two extremes. Now, the ones that are closest to our system are the ones that deliberately adopted part of the Commonwealth countries where we exported our system with the divided rectangle, as against, say, the continental, the French, where you have them all arrayed, the members in a semicircle around the executive, which is like the American Congress. The nearest equivalents are those Commonwealth countries, and they've made changes in various ways, but still fundamentally they are Westminster-type parliaments. But the others, they do it differently. They have different traditions, histories, cultures. And you can classify them along that line from the transformative to the arena.
And Lord Hailsham, Conservative Lord Chancellor in the 1950s, 60s, memorably described this system as the House of Commons in its sovereign state as an elective dictatorship. Is that a fair description?
Well, I'm interested to note, said that before he had come back into government as the Lord Chancellor, and while Lord Chancellor he did nothing to alter this system. He wasn't a critic of it. Again, elective dictatorship, I've tried to describe to you that I don't think it is a dictatorship. It's elected, yes, and it isn't a highly presidential system. There's still cabinet collective responsibility, even with a coalition. There's discussion within government, and there is the accountability of the government to the House of Commons. And the voters could vote the rascals out. It'd be a bit longer now. But there's always that threat that we won't win the next election. So it's elective. I don't see that it's a dictatorship.
But you're saying that in a system which had a formal separation of powers between the legislature, the executive and the judiciary, just leave the judiciary to one side for a moment, that in this system the separation of the legislature and the executive are effectively reconfigured, differently expressed, but that the same kind of forces are at play. Is that what you're saying?
That sounds right. I think I'm saying that.
Okay, I think you were. I just thought we'd check. Right, okay, that's the end. Thank you very much, George.